Hi there, it's Dorothy Golden here, and we are going to continue with our web development series. And for this series, we are going to learn how to build websites using HTML, CSS, and also advanced styling using Bootstrap. And on the other hand, version control using Git and GitHub. So before we get started, we are going to start right away by setting up our development environment. And before we actually do that, we're also going to get insights on what IDEs are. Now, when you are trying to program, just like the way you could wake up someday and maybe you notice that you're going to cook. So you're always going to, for example, use a saucepan to prepare the food. And without the saucepan, you not have the ability of really preparing the food. So that is the same case in that when we are working with programming, for example, if you're trying to build a site or any kind of software product, you're always going to need an integrated development environment. Now, before I also introduce, I think this one, most of the times by default, there are some default editors that we have. And if you're using Windows operating system, then this is the default editor called Notepad, where you can always have the ability of still maybe one, saving something or taking note of something maybe that you're going to do or maybe learning at some point. And also you always have the ability of writing your source code, as we shall see. You can always write your source code in here, but it becomes very hectic and the process of development becomes very long when you're using this kind of editors. So we always have what you call as the integrated development environment, known as an IDE, and this is always going to be a software application or an application software that provides comprehensive tools to help developers write, test, and debug code efficiently. Just like when you're cooking, you're always going to ensure that you're making use of the saucepan. So most of the times, if it is going to be like a normal saucepan, if we are trying to compare it with how an ID works, we could assume that maybe if initially you're trying to cook rice, and by the time you now think about maybe upgrading or you are modernizing, you could maybe get a rice cooker. So it's going to still cook the rice, but it's going to be an improved version. So the IDEs are always going to be fully packaged with whatever we need to ease up the development process. So the IDE is, of course, most of the times going to help you to really write your code faster, just like how you could go ahead and make use of a modern rice cooker than the normal saucepan. So IDEs always come prepackaged with a text editor, and in here you're always going to have the ability of going ahead and writing in the source code based on a particular language. Then on the other hand, they're always going to have the ability. Of course, depending on the language, you could have a compiler or an interpreter. Then they also come with a debugger in that you have the ability of identifying and fixing an error or a defect in your source code. And most of them also provide what you call as the syntax highlighting, in that most of the IDEs are always going to come pre-built in that the keywords are always going to be highlighted in a particular color. And on the other hand, we also have auto-completion. Then most of the IDEs are also currently integrated with version control. In here, where we could have the ability of working with Git by running up some Git commands. So most of the times you're going to notice that if you're making use of an IDE like Visual Studio Code, maybe instead of running the commands manually, you could always go ahead and make use of the graphical user interface, in that you have the ability of really pushing up your code or committing or staging or unstaging, depending on what exactly you're doing. So IDEs are always going to speeden up the development process for us than manually working with, for example, the default text editors like Notepad. So the fact that we are going to be learning HTML, we are going to ensure that one, we have an integrated development environment. It's more like a tool that you must use when you're going to, for example, create a site or web system. Or even if it's not a site, as long as it is a software product, you're always going to need the IDE, and this always depends on the language that you're going to use. However, there are some default, I wouldn't say default, but there are some general IDEs that you can actually use for any language by enabling some extensions. So for this series, we are going to really work with Visual Studio Code. However, you may use any text editor, but Visual Studio Code is highly recommended for this series, and it is one of the commonly used IDEs out there. So the beauty with Visual Studio Code is of the fact that it is very lightweight. It doesn't require a lot of MBs for you to go ahead and download it. And also when it comes to the storage, it doesn't consume a lot of space. And it provides a number of features for you to really work on your project. Then on the other hand, it comes fully embedded with the ability for you to integrate any third-party library. These are commonly what we call as extensions that are going to help you to build up your software product. However, if you're not using Visual Studio Code, on the other hand, you could maybe work with Sublime Text, and this is really fast, customizable, and powerful. So most of these, of course, you can always go ahead and check them out. So for example, if it is Visual Studio Code, when I try to check it out, most of them you can always distinguish them based on the logos. Now for Visual Studio Code, just like the way it sounds, it's going to have this kind of V-like logo, but of course the logo is going to be in blue. So whenever you see this kind of logo right here, this is Visual Studio Code. Then on the other hand, if you're interested in Sublime Text, you can check it out. Sublime is always going to have this kind of S logo right here and in this kind of color. Then on the other hand, if you're really interested in Atom, which is also open source, and actually most of these are really open source. On the other hand, you can always go ahead and build and download them without any pay. So they really come on a freemium version, so you can always download and use, most especially for Visual Studio Code. However, there are some that, for example, if you're using IntelliJ, you notice that most of the times you're going to have maybe a free plan, and at some point of time you will have to upgrade. So you can always check all of these out just to get to know about their logos and maybe some other insights like that. So for our series, it's a requirement for you to ensure that you do have Visual Studio Code installed. And it's always going to help you to write clean code that is efficient, and also code that is error-free because of the fact that we can easily debug the code. And it's of course going to make learning, for example, HTML or that particular language that you've chosen to learn easier and more interactive. So putting all that aside, we are going to go ahead and install Visual Studio Code. So you must install Visual Studio Code based on the current operating system that you're using. So currently I'm making use of Windows operating system. So how do you really download softwares that we are going to be using locally? So most of the times you really have to know the name of the software. For example, if it is Visual Studio Code, you can always open up your browser, and of course you go ahead and access a new tab. Then you type the name of the software. So Visual Studio Code it also has a shortcut of VS. You can type Visual Studio Code Windows download. Of course, for your case, if you're using Mac, you update this instead of Windows, you make use of the Mac operating system, and same applies for Linux. That is if you're explicitly interested in downloading based on the operating system. So the search results right here, you go ahead and click on them, but the first one, of course. Then you're going to be redirected on the page that shows how you can install all the setup based on the operating system that you are using. So the first one, of course, is for Windows, and currently Visual Studio Code provides the software based on Windows 10 and 11. So versions 10s and higher are fully compatible. Then on the other hand, if you're making use of the Linux operating systems, would have maybe Ubuntu or Fedora, you can always check out these. Then on the other hand, if you have a MacBook, of course you have the Mac operating system, so you go ahead and download. So this cuts across for any software. So all you have to do is to click on these buttons. So for example, for my case, I have Windows operating system. So you go ahead and click just like I am trying to click right here. So at that point of time, you must pay attention to the icon that is right here. So this icon shows that the file is being downloaded. And of course, you always have the ability of clicking onto this icon. And the first thing you should always mind about is the file itself. Most of the times it's supposed to be an executable file. So executable files are always going to have a .exe file extension to show that it is an executable file. And having downloaded that, my bad, you are of course going to go ahead and download and install the file. So you notice that the first icon, when I try to hover on it, it shows that we can open this file into the folder where it was downloaded, or we can also go ahead and open it up. So if I try out the first approach, notice that it shows that this is the setup. Then on the other hand, if I went ahead and automatically selected the open, because this is what we are supposed to do, you open up that downloads icon, then you select open. So if it is your first time downloading this kind of software, you must consent to their agreement. So whenever I have time, you can always go through the agreement so that the consent is informative. So for my case, I'm just, okay, I wouldn't say I'm just, but I believe that yes, I do consent, and yeah, I agree with whatever is there. So you go ahead and select I accept the agreement. But of course, it is recommended ethically that you get time and look into the agreement and see what is in there. Most of the times you could agree to the agreement, and then that the agreement in there has something like the software is going to be collecting maybe your data, or the software is going to be tracking whatever activities that you're going to do. So the moment you consent, then there is no way you're going to be reporting out there that this kind of tool is trying to get my data, yet you agreed. So you can always check it out. Then you click next. Now, very important to note, for this kind of setup, I really recommend you putting a lot of focus on what you call as the addition or the additional icons. The first one is if you're really interested in ensuring that Visual Studio Code is going to have a shortcut on the desktop. So what does this really mean? It means that so if you go ahead and enable that checkbox, you're going to see something like this. Of course, for my case, I really don't have it, but we assume that this is the Visual Studio logo. So you're always going to have the ability of opening up the tool by clicking onto the desktop right here. That is what that checkbox is trying to show. Then on the other hand, we also have these other additional icons. The first one, of course, has open with code. Now, I also recommend you to ensure that you go ahead and check that out. For example, if I really actually clicked on this folder and selected this folder and right-clicked, you notice that I have the option of open with code. So if you do not check that box, there is no way you're going to have that option while you maybe access a folder. It's not going to be there. So you must ensure that you are really checking that box right away. So most of the times you have to ensure that you check it out. However, that's an option, but to ensure that you quickly open up the folder in Visual Studio Code, you can always open and check it out. Then, of course, these others, you can keep them in place. Then, most importantly, ensuring that you do not uncheck this other checkbox that says Add Visual Studio Code to Path. So you can leave this selected, then we continue. If you're interested in seeing the logo as a shortcut on your desktop, then you can check this as well. Then once that is done, you go ahead and click onto the next button. So I click onto next. Then at this point of time, you're supposed to now install. So you click onto the install button right here. So I go ahead and click onto it. Then the installation, most of the times it can take some time based on your internet speed. So just ensure that you have stable internet, though some of the wizards might not require internet. It depends on the software. So just to be safe, you can always ensure that you have the internet turned on as well. However, when you're downloading, it is a requirement that you must have internet. But optionally, during the installation, sometimes you wouldn't really require the internet. So it depends. So you notice that at this point of time, the software is being extracted into my current path. So sorry, it's going to make the installations based on the default setup for Visual Studio Code that was already configured based on the operating system that you have. So once you're done, you click on finish. So having it installed now, for my case, the fact that I already did have Visual Studio Code, of course, now it's automatically opening up these other folders that I did have. But initially, you're going to have something like this. Commonly, you're also going to have a welcome file like this is here. So you can always go ahead and close it up, but maybe before we close it up, by making use of the X icon, we can get quick insights. So if you really wanted to create a new file in maybe a particular folder, or even the same window, you can always click on new file. If you wanted to open a file, you can always click onto this other option. If you wanted to open up a folder, you do the same. If you wanted to clone an etc. And based on the fact that I've really been using Visual Studio Code already, so it also keeps track of the recent folders that have been opened into Visual Studio Code. So having opened Visual Studio Code, you can always go ahead and close up the welcome file, just like the way if you have a visitor, having let the visitor inside your house, of course, you're going to close the door and now tell them maybe to sit somewhere so that you embark onto the business that the visitor came for. So at this point of time, we are going to take a quick one onto how the graphical user interface for Visual Studio Code looks like. Now, starting off, of course, with the most useful one is the section on your left side. I'm going to start off with the themes. Now, at this point of time, you notice that Visual Studio Code has a dark theme, whereby the whole tool is in black or a darker shade of, quite dark anyway, of black. So starting off with the themes, there is an icon right here. So this kind of icon, let me try to zoom in a little. This kind of icon is always going to be at the bottom left corner right here. So when you check it out, it's more like a settings icon. When you open it up, it's going to bring this other model. So we are mainly going to be interested in the themes for now. So you select themes and then you go to the color theme. So there are a number of themes that you can work with using Visual Studio Code. So I'm going to do a quick demo on the dark themes. So for example, there is the default one of dark Visual Studio. So when I check it out, you notice that the shade is not that dark, but yeah. And on the other hand, the bottom bar is actually turning purple. Then if you are really not that much interested into this one, then you still go back to the settings icon, then you select themes, then color theme, and switch back. For example, there is the one I was using, dark modern, which is always going to be the default theme, and it is, I think, more darker compared to the first one that we did try. Then on the other hand, if I go ahead and try to check out these other themes, we also have dark plus. So dark plus is also looks like the first one we did try out. So the point here is ensuring that you go for a theme that is not going to affect your eyes. Because for instance, there are some light themes, when I check it out, you notice that the IDE is very, very bright. And on the other hand, of course, we have other themes out there that are also light. Notice that there is this one, it's not that, I think it has a white smoke shade and a blend of purple. So we really rarely work with such colorful themes because we believe that you're going to spend a lot of time maybe working on a project. So you must mind about the health of your eyes. Then some of you who do some hacking, you could check out the red color theme. But of course, you could find it appealing anyway, but it looks so scary, as if the whole system crashed. So the one I recommend are the ones I recommend are the dark themes. So personally, I could switch to this one, or on the other hand, I could switch to the dark modern default. So once you're done, that is what you really need for the color themes for now. Then we are going to navigate through the menu on the left. So right here is the menu, and it does have a number of items. Starting off with the first one, most of the times you can always hover. Hovering is bringing the cursor and placing it next to the icons that you're seeing, because this is a graphical user interface. So the first one is the one that opens up the Explorer, showing the files and folders, actually showing the main folder that you have opened up and also the contents of the folder. So for now, we don't have any folder open. Then on the other hand, let me try to clear this up very fast. Then on the other hand, we also have the icon for version control. That is if you really want to work with Git in your folders. So you go ahead and create a new local repository. You could initialize your folder so that you have the ability of tracking all the modifications that are occurring in your folder and maybe pushing to a remote repository. Then in addition to that, we also have the next icon right here that gives you the ability of running and debugging. So for instance, if you're making use of languages like Python, you could go ahead and run your script. So this is the feature that gives you that ability. Then last but not least, we also have the other icon that we are really going to work with pretty much. That is going to always give us the ability of installing extensions. So this kind of icon that looks like a box, of course, okay, not a box, but it's containing, okay, we can just assume that it has a number of boxes, and with one at the right being changed, that I think the direction was a little twisted. So this is what we call as the extensions icon, and it's always going to give you the ability of installing and uninstalling or modifying any kind of third-party library that you want to work with. For instance, for this case, we are really going to ensure that we do have the HTML or the HTML and CSS support extension. So with extensions, there are those that are going to be installed. Then you're also going to get recommendations. But the main point is for you having the ability of searching, because on the other hand, you can always as well go ahead and filter. So if I check out what is installed, notice that all these are installed. Extensions that are already installed, you're always not going to see the installation button on the right side. But for instance, if maybe I really wanted to go ahead and install a particular framework, okay, if you really wanted to do so, you can go ahead and search, for example, for the name of the extension. For instance, HTML CSS support. Now at this point of time, notice that this is the extension. So when we are installing extensions, you are supposed to select, of course, having search for the name of the extension. When it's popped out, like when you do have a number of options, most of the times you want to go for options that have a higher rating or a higher review, right? But for our case, we are going to make use of the HTML CSS support. So you select the extension. By default, it's not going to be installed. So if I try to uninstall it and then I restart, so by default, this is how the extension is going to look like. You're always going to see the installation button. So what you're supposed to do is to always go ahead and click on install, which is going to be a call to action button to ensure that the files that you need, or maybe the extension itself, is always going to go ahead and get installed. So click on install. Then at this point of time, the extension is going to be installed. And for any extension that you do install, you're always going to see a new file. So you do not have to get worried or maybe a little confused because of the new file. Just shows that, hey, my friend, this extension has been installed, and if you really wanted to get more insights, the file is always going to give you more insights on what the extension is about and the kind of features that it entails. So for now, that is how we are going to really work with it. And on the other hand, there is this other one, but of course this works for Dockerization. So for now, I'm not going to go into that. And then I have this other one for Postman. So for your case, of course, you're not going to see all these others because I had enabled them in my IDE. But the first four, I do believe that they are the standard and default icons that everyone is always going to see. Then on the other hand, I actually don't have the agent. The fact that we are into, I think it's also there. The fact that we are into the world of AI, you might see something like this, beautiful. I think it wasn't opened. If you see this kind of panel on the right, this is the AI agent panel, in that you can always maybe try to learn something, go work on a project with AI, but when you're learning, it is recommended that you first challenge yourself before you start switching into making use of AI. But of course, it is always going to be there for you. Then putting that aside, we are now moving on to the top menu right here. Now regarding this menu, is going to have file, then edit, then selection, and then the other more icon. So for that note, frequently you're always going to make use of the file menu item. So you open it up, it has the ability for you to create a new text file, a new window, open folders, and etc. So you can always open it up chap, and get to select whatever you want to do. Then on the other hand, most importantly, you can always work with the terminal. So the other beauty with IDEs is the fact that they always come up with what you call as a terminal. And a terminal is always going to be a command line interface tool that you can make use of to run particular commands. So terminals would vary maybe based on your operating system, but I think this is the default standard. You're always going to have now I'm not so sure if Mac OS really has PowerShell, but if you're using Windows, you're always going to see PowerShell. Then I believe for Mac OS, you could have a different terminal, but at least a terminal that would work just like Linux or the Unix-like environments is the one that we call as Git Bash. So with terminals, you're always going to make interactions with your machine via commands. So for example, if I went ahead and typed pwd, notice that it tells me that, okay, you are now accessing this current path. If I really wanted to navigate onto the desktop, I could make use of commands like change directory, then the desktop name, I pass it on, such that now you notice that right here, the path now changes and it shows that I am now on the desktop. So this kind of approach is very common for those that have Unix-like environments. And in terms of Windows, the ability for you to really bring out that kind of feel is when you're making use of Git Bash. Then on the other hand, of course, if I really wanted to again confirm my path, you notice that I am on the desktop. If I wanted to go ahead and maybe clear up the terminal, you can type clear. You notice that it goes ahead and clears up whatever I had written. Then, of course, to open up the terminal, there are some commands that you can still work with. Let me try to open it right here. So I'm trying to open up my on-screen keyboard. So for example, if you wanted to go ahead and open up the terminal, like making use of the shortcuts instead of the graphical user interface, let me first close it up. You press Ctrl, then on the on-screen keyboard, I don't know if I can really annotate it, but on the on-screen keyboard, there is this other key. So you first of all go ahead and press Ctrl, then it's more like a backtick. So you ensure that you press all of these at the same time. So the terminal is always going to be opened up for you right away. So for my case, I'll go ahead and ensure that I do that chap. Or if it's not working out, maybe if you have an issue with your terminal, I mean your keyboard, you can always right click, then select new terminal. So by default, it's always going to open up PowerShell, but the difference with PowerShell and Git Bash is based on the fact that most of the commands that are Unix-like structured, they're not going to run in Windows-like operating systems. So if I went ahead and typed pwd, notice that this shows that I am I'm in this path. And if I typed cd change directory, I want to navigate onto the desktop, then I do it. Now you notice that the path changes. So if you're using Windows, this is how the path is going to look like. On the other hand, if you're using Unix-like environments, this is how the path would look like. So if I type, for example, ls shows that it should give us the ability of listing the current files and folders in this current path. You notice that these are the current folders and files I have on my desktop, like we did see with the intro to software. And this is the intro to software. Okay, let me try to make use of the desktop itself. So intro to software, you notice that this is the folder itself. So you can always navigate through your file system by making use of the command line interface. So how do we always open up a folder in Visual Studio Code? So having installed Visual Studio Code, you go ahead and right-click the folder that you're interested in. So first of all, you access the folder, then you right-click, then you select the option of Open with Code. So at this point of time, you're going to notice that the folder is going to be opened up in Visual Studio Code, and this is going to be the default structure. So you always start off by trusting the authors, and then the folder is going to be fully opened up. So by default, you're going to see the build with agent panel. So you can always go ahead and close it up right here. Then you also do the same for the welcome file. So the moment you really open up a folder in Visual Studio Code, the name of the folder is always going to be visible. So at this point of time, notice that this is a folder called Intro to Software. Just giving you an example. Then the beauty of Visual Studio Code is that if a folder has some other subfolders, you can always open them out. So the difference between a folder and a file is based on these current icons that you're seeing. So any folder is always going to have its icon either looking down or maybe on the right. So whenever it is looking down, just like you can see this other one for HTML basics, this really shows that the folder has been opened up and you can view its contents. However, when you look at this other subfolder for the images, you notice that yes, it is also a folder. However, at this point of time, the icon is looking on to the right, or it is pointing to the right, meaning that the folder is not yet opened. So if I went ahead and opened it up, you notice that it has only one image. So that is how folders are always going to be designed if we are making use of the graphical user interface. Then on the other hand, when it comes to files are always going to be stored in that they are always going to have what you call as a file extension. Now for a file extensions depend on the type of a file. For the fact that you are going to be making use of HTML, you're going to notice that all HTML files are going to have a .html file extension onto them. So after the file name, for example, about is the file name and the HTML is now the extension. Now, most of the times, for example, if you don't see these icons that are into less than and greater than sign, it means that you haven't named the file in the standard way for HTML. For example, this other file that has helper file, you notice that for it, it has these uneven lines. These lines that are horizontal, but of course they're having different sizes. So this really shows that it is a default text file. So whenever you notice that there is a change into those, then you have to go ahead and rename your files. Whenever you are renaming, of course, you're always going to go ahead and click on the file, then you right click. So when you right click, you're going to see a number of options right here. Let me try to maximize. Let me try to maximize. Where is this thing? Okay, let's proceed. So for example, if I went ahead and tried to rename, you're always going to go ahead and right click the file or even a folder. Then you select out the rename option on this long list. Then it's of course going to give you the ability of editing. For example, if I went ahead and updated it to updated, notice that the file name changes. Then on the other hand, if you wanted to create a new file or a new folder in this file panel, for the main folder we opened up, there is this space that is always going to appear on the left. Let me try to annotate it for you. So there is this space that is always going to be inside. It's more like a vertical rectangle. Let me try to annotate it furthermore. So this space inside it is going to contain all the files and subfolders that point to your exact folder that you did open up. However, whenever you want to, for example, go ahead and add a new file, you have the ability of doing this by accessing these icons. When I move on to the first one, it says that new file, then the second one, new folder, then this other one is for refreshing, then the other one to collapse whatever is in here. So if you wanted to create a new file, for example, in this current folder, you notice that it is the current folder because of the fact that it has been selected with blue borders. And it's also the same case if I clicked anywhere into this path. Notice that there's going to be this kind of blue rectangle with the borders here. So I could go ahead and, for example, create a new file called demo.html. And you notice that the file is going to be automatically created. Then if you wanted a new folder, you go ahead and select this other icon. Then, for example, you also give it a name of demo folder. Then it's also going to get created in here. So the file is going to have, for example, these kind of icons, less than and greater than if it's an HTML file, and then a folder is going to have those arrow icons, one that looks down to show that it has been opened but it doesn't have contents, and the other one that looks on the right to show that it has been minimized. You can also go ahead and drag and drop a folder for it can be a folder or a file. For example, if it is a file, I can drag it and drop it into the demo folder, then I say move. So it's now into the demo folder. When I minimize, you notice that the contents are in there. Then on the other hand, of course, if we are starting afresh, most of the times you want to go ahead and start off by, for example, creating a new folder. For example, you right click onto your desktop and you assign the folder a new name, for example, web series. Then using the first approach, you select the folder, you right click, then you select open with code. Then you notice that at this point of time, this is the folder called web series, and it doesn't have any kind of content in here. So the first thing you're supposed to do, of course, is to go ahead and close up the AI agent and also the welcome file, that is if it is open. And at this point of time, you can at least see that the folder doesn't have any content into it. So moving forward, we are always supposed to ensure that we have all the extensions that we are going to be working with when it comes to the practical work. So the first extension is the one of the HTML CSS support. So you access the extensions icon, you click on it, then it opens up this panel. And right here, you go ahead and search for the HTML CSS support, this extension that I had given insights on. Then you ensure that it is installed. Then having done that, we also need prettier. So you can search for prettier code formatter. Oh, actually, I haven't given insights on the first extension. So for the first extension, it's always going to give us the ability of working with the HTML tags, in that the is going to be automatically auto-completed for us or suggested. And on the other hand, ability for us to work with also the CSS properties and, of course, ability of us accessing the CSS values. Then, in addition to that, you must go ahead and install the Prettier Code Formatter, and it is always going to give us the ability of formatting or beautifying our code so that it looks pretty, just like if you are calling oneself pretty. Then on the other hand, just ensure that maybe you also have autosave, just in case your files are not, contents of your file are not being saved. So you search for autosave, then you can go for save typing and ensure that it is installed. Then in addition to that, we are going to be working with the HTML web pages, and we must be able to test them and ensure that, for example, the modifications are automatically added as we code. So therefore, you search for the live server extension. So this is the extension itself. You just have to go ahead and ensure that it is installed. Then in addition to that, you can also go ahead and maybe search for auto rename to ensure that when you are renaming a file, you have the ability of the closing tag also being automatically updated. So you search for auto rename this, and you ensure that it's also installed. So feel free to go ahead and comment any other extension that could be so much helpful moving forward, and maybe I haven't stated it out there. Then maybe sometimes most people are also interested in what we call as the rainbow brackets. Rainbow, yeah, I think this one has 4.5, 4.5. This one, okay. This one is, what is the extension is predicted. Okay. So for now, I think these extensions, the ones that we have, I believe you've enabled, can really help us to get our hands dirty moving forward. So having ensured that all the extensions are already installed, then I can also go ahead and give you insights on how you could maybe open up a folder by drag and drop. For example, if I went ahead and dragged and dropped, so I am trying to select the folder called Python Mastery Crash Course, then I long press, then I drag it and release it into the current window. So you notice that having done that, the contents of the file are going to be automatically opened up. And when I open up the File Explorer, you notice that these are the current files for the folder. So you can always open up the contents of the folder through a drag and drop. Then lastly, those that are always interested into working with commands. For instance, if I wanted to ensure that I open up this folder via some commands, open up the folder, then I kindly request that you pay closer attention onto this current path. So this is the name of the folder, and having opened it up, you can select anywhere inside this space. So for example, if I click right here, you notice that it goes ahead and provides the path for the folder. So by default, it's always going to be highlighted. Then you can go ahead and press Ctrl A on your keyboard. Then you remove the contents of the folder. Then you go ahead and type CMD. When you enter CMD, then you press Enter on your keyboard. So having done that, the contents of the folder, of course not the contents, the folder itself, it's always going to be opened up in the default terminal. For my case, it is the command prompt. And right here, you're supposed to go ahead and type a command. You type code space dot, then press enter. So this is only going to work if you enabled the open with code while installing the software. So at this point of time, notice that still the folder is going to be opened up. Then I also remember that I gave you a quick demo on the git bash terminal, but please note that git bash only works if you have what you call as the git software already installed on your machine. So the git software is what we shall use for version control, and you can always as well go ahead and check it out, install it based on your operating system. So that is how the development environment must be set up. So feel free to go ahead and try to explore any other feature that maybe I haven't given insights on. If you wanted to minimize the window or maximize, you can make use of this icon, editing, undoing, pretty much. So kindly go ahead and try to navigate through and ensure that you're really conversant or maybe comfortable with the graphical user interface. Most importantly, ensuring that you can create a new file into this path or a new folder, and of course having the ability of opening up the extensions panel and installing the extensions that we need. So as I wrap up this session, for example, if I wanted to go ahead and create a simple HTML file, all HTML files are going to have the .html file extension. So having provided in the name, of course, you precede this with a full stop or a dot, then the file extension. So at this point of time, you're going to notice that we are going to have this kind of cursor blinking. This shows that this is what you call as the text editor, where you are supposed to go ahead and write. So having ensured that you have the HTML CSS support extension installed, you can always, for example, access the exclamation mark. Then you select it. Then this goes ahead and creates an automatic boilerplate for HTML right here. Or if you're really not making use of this approach, then of course you could go ahead and install the HTML boilerplate extension. So you can search for it. Then you're going to notice that this, you can actually check this out or this other one. It is all okay as long as it's doing what we really need. So the HTML boilerplate also gives you the ability of automatically having what you call as the standard HTML page structure for you. So instead of, for example, using the first approach, I could redo whatever I did by, in this case, typing HTML or HTML, then you select the HTML5 boilerplate. At this point of time, you notice that you're still going to have a standard structure for HTML, but the difference is that you're going to have these other extra comments, and these are always going to be in green. And same applies to this other right here. And the beauty is that in case you wanted to go ahead and link up maybe some style sheet, you could have the ability of doing so, making use of the link tags. Or if you really had a JavaScript file, then you can also go ahead and link it up right here. So the approach depends on what you really want to achieve. If you're not using HTML and CSS right away, then of course you could go for the first approach by making use or by typing an exclamation mark. So you type the exclamation mark, then you select that option, then the IDE is going to automatically autofill the contents in this text editor. So I'm not really going to dive into the structure of the HTML file for this session, but we shall learn about it in the next session when having an introduction to HTML. But for now, let me just go ahead and add a simple heading called development, setup, just to make you happy. That is if you're really much of a beginner. So having added that heading or the HTML H1 tag, you notice that right here at the bottom, there is a text that says go live. So most of the times when we are working with HTML, we must have the ability to open up the contents of the HTML file by making use of what we call as a web browser, which is going to be a software application that helps us to view the contents of our web page. So if I'm starting off with a first approach, I go ahead and I click on to go live. Then at this point of time, you can see that the heading has been displayed right here, development, setup. And if I went ahead and maybe try to add some other tag, for example, maybe I'm making use of the H4, then I typed something like working with IDEs, right? Then something simple in terms of paragraph, I add something like recommended one is VS Code. Of course, I'm keeping it precise for the purpose of having a quick demo. So you notice that I have the ability of looking at the output of the web page. And of course, this is Google Chrome based on this logo down here. Did it really save? Let me confirm. Okay. So most times you can still go ahead and refresh by clicking on to, but this happens once in a while in case maybe the contents of the page are not being reflected. You can always go ahead and click onto that icon. So this is a quick one on how you can go ahead and open up the contents of the web page that we have created. Then if you're not using that approach, you can still go ahead and access the folder where the file is stored. For example, index.html is the folder. It is the file right here. And you notice that it has a logo of Google Chrome because Google Chrome is my default browser. So if I wanted to view the contents of this page, I right-click the file. Oh, okay. You can always right-click and then click on open, or you can double-click and it's going to be automatically opened up in the browser. So the difference with these approaches is that for the second approach, this is how the path is going to look like. It's going to be a local Windows operating system path. Notice that it has index.html and the other one, when I access this other path, you notice that it has what you call as the IP address, which is pointing to the local host, and also the name of the file. The difference is that for the first approach, this one where we are making use of the live server, most of the times whenever we make modifications into our file, they are always going to be automatically triggered or automatically added there for us without maybe manually refreshing. Let me see what have I done. Okay, so I think I accidentally closed up the folder. So I can click on File, then open Recent, then the Web Series folder. So if I really wanted maybe to make some modifications, maybe if I wanted to add a simple description of what an IDE is, I could go ahead and type something chap, or I could actually go ahead and access the notes right here and copy whatever is here. Let me try to copy it up very fast. Then go ahead and paste. So the beauty with IDEs is that you can always work with shortcuts. You can copy, running a Ctrl+C and then Ctrl+V for pasting. Then you can always format your work. For example, at this point of time, notice that my content is really disorganized. The word that efficiently and features at the start and these others are in front. So you can always right click anywhere, then you select format. So you notice that now the content is way cleaner or better. So having done that, when you go back to the web page, and I think I don't have autosave, or okay, my bad. So of course, most of the times, if the web page shows something like this, it means that the live server is not running. So you click on go live again. And at this point of time, now you can see that the contents are right here. So if I wanted to add the modification again while the page is now serving, being served, I can click this here, then navigate back into the source code, and maybe I wanted to go ahead and add another paragraph. We shall learn about the tags moving forward. Then I go ahead and select the formatting of the document. So you notice that at this point of time, this document has the ability of really adding this other paragraph without me again coming and reloading the page. And lastly, if I really wanted to add something else, I could still come back. For example, if I wanted to add another heading in terms of HTML, could, for example, type an H3, then I add the heading of the popular IDEs for HTML development. So you notice that this content, this heading is also automatically added. But for this other document, for this other approach, I mean, for it to be able to get all those changes that I had added in the first approach, you always actually have to come and refresh manually. For any modifications, you must access the refresh icon. This icon, which is like a C that has an arrow, it is what we call as the refresh icon. If I went ahead and maybe added a simple list chap, maybe talking about the popular IDEs, and then of course in this one I'm going to add Visual Studio Code, then I could add a simple list item for Visual Studio Code. Then having done that, you notice that this is our manual way. So you must go ahead and actually click the reload page. Then at this point of time, we now notice that the list is here for the option. However, on the other approach, we do not have to manually refresh. So for it, it's going to automatically have that option. So that is the difference between making use of the live server and also manually accessing the file from the file explorer. So at this point of time, you can still see that this is an HTML file or a simple HTML web page. And of course, I have made use of some quick tags right here, like headings, having different levels from H1. We also have H4 and H3. Then some other tags like the P for paragraph, that is if you wanted to add a description. Then the other one I worked with is one of the lists. If I wanted maybe to add another list for maybe Sublime text or maybe Sublime, you notice that I have the ability of still adding what we call as a list item. Then for this other approach, which is manual, I have to refresh to get the update. Then on the other one, for it automatically has the update. So all these are HTML tags and HTML features. So we are going to learn about this furthermore in detail so that we understand what is HTML, which is the hypertext markup language for creating web pages. So that is it for this session. Thanks for watching and see you into the next session where we are really going to focus on understanding what HTML is and why we really have to learn how to make use of it. And of course, understanding the default HTML basic page structure, like one that I have already created right here. So bye-bye.